welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, good evening. Today we are wrapping up our series on obsession in literature from around the world by comparing all three books in this series: Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, The Tunnel by Ernesto Sabato, and The Limeworks by Thomas Bernhard. If you are a first-time listener, join our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. You can reach that by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. And we'd love it if you would subscribe to us and let your friends know about this podcast. In this episode, we will be talking spoilers. So if you're in the process of reading a book, you can check out our review episodes, which were published over the last few weeks. Next week, we will begin our next series on Afrofuturism with a review of Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler.
So, in my opinion, at least, I don't know if you guys agree, but I think all of these novels have something to say at art. In Pale Fire, we have Shade's poem, and we have Kinboat's reaction to it. In The Tunnel, we have Castell's painting, Maternity. And then in The Limeworks, we have Conrad's reading of Novalis, Kropotkin, and also his fascination with this painting he seems to have by Francis Bacon. I think all novels have some interest in art and its importance to people and the way it can connect people. But do you think that all of these novels see art in the same way? When they look, are they seeing the same thing?
I don't think so. I think they're looking at different things. Especially, I feel that Conrad and Bernhard are going for something different. All of these books deal with the difficulty or the impossibility of connection and communication. But with Bernhard, I feel like with his character Conrad, he's going for something that's less about art and more about communication and connection specifically, versus connection or understanding over a single shared work. With Pale Fire, it's all about Shade's poem. And with The Tunnel, it's all about Castell's painting. But with Conrad, it's about miscommunication over various things, not just a single thing that the characters are all focused on.
I think that there is an aspect of traditionalism in Pale Fire and also in The Tunnel that I think that perhaps Nabokov and Sabato would take issue with. In Pale Fire, I think that the entire text itself and the structure of the text is kind of at odds with the content of the poem, Pale Fire. Shade's poem, I think, is this very sort of typical confessional style poem. It's very sincere. If you recall in that episode, I said that the poem is very sincere, but the book is at odds with that sincerity. And I think that the traditional move that we find inside of The Tunnel is this idea that art is something that can connect two people together, and two people who have the same taste or the same understanding of a work of art can be connected to each other in some way. Is this a connection that you think is reasonable, or is this just something that I'm reading into it?
Are you talking about Castell's painting specifically?
Well, in general, what I'm saying is that the books have an anti-traditional view towards art, and not necessarily that Castell's painting is good or bad, but the idea that people who understand art in the same way are connected to each other is bogus. I think that's part of what Sabato is trying to say with that part of the novel.
I can see that in all three. In The Tunnel, it's very clear because Castell obviously believes the painting is a kind of tunnel that will link him to Maria, but it's proven to be untrue. I also see it in the other two books as well. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, that you can see it in all three? Or just in Pale Fire and The Tunnel?
I'm very confident in that reading of The Tunnel. I'm not so sure that anything similar applies in The Limeworks, only because we don't really understand much of what Conrad's fascination with Kropotkin is, and we don't really understand much of his fascination with this Francis Bacon painting that he has. His wife really likes this Novalis, but he doesn't seem to care for it. So it seems like Bernhard has something to say about that kind of fiction that I haven't really investigated. But I do think that there is something there. It's an attitude being expressed.
What do you think Bernhard is saying with Conrad not wanting to get rid of the Francis Bacon, that that's the absolute last thing he'll ever part with?
If I had to guess, and this is just kind of off the cuff, I would say that I think the reason why Bernhard includes this bit about Conrad not being able to give up his Francis Bacon painting is that there's something of a kindred spirit in Francis Bacon, the way he depicts people. I think that Conrad appreciates the way that Bacon is so uncompromising and extreme in his depiction of human unpleasantness. But as far as Pale Fire, I do think it might be something different. It's anti-traditional, but perhaps anti-traditional in a different way.
Because it's dealing more with form rather than with other aspects of art, with shared art?
Like I had said in the previous episode, I do think that the poem Pale Fire is marked by sincerity. I think it's a kind of poetry that a reader is supposed to encounter and feel like he is receiving some sort of sincere expression of emotion from an author. But I don't think that's what's happening with Nabokov's Pale Fire. I think the novel is something quite different. Do you see that difference?
I see the difference. We covered this in our episode, I think, where I think you were talking about this, Ed, about how the book Pale Fire upends this idea that you can actually have a canonical reading of a poem, because it shows us through Kinboat that there's a lot of misreading that goes on. Even though the poem might be quite obvious in its subject matter, the reader can still misunderstand it.
I think that's adjacent in my mind. I guess it's just this idea that the value of a work of art is the expression of something sincere. Like, I don't think of Nabokov as a sincere artist at all. I think that it's never his goal to make you weep or cry or to believe that something in his life is important.
So if you're talking about art's ability to connect people, does that necessarily mean that the art in question has to be sincere?
I would say no. When I encounter Pale Fire, I love the novel, and I love Nabokov because I think he has created something really interesting and a unique object. But I don't love him because I feel like he has experienced something human and important that we share. I don't think that he has revealed himself in this work, which is, I think, what somebody who read Pale Fire, the poem, would have felt. They'd say, oh, this is John Shade. And the reason why this poem is important is because we are seeing parts of John Shade that normally we don't get to see.
I think it's fitting that we read the line works because we talked about Wittgenstein, about how it's very difficult to communicate sometimes basic ideas. Here, I think we are rubbing up against the limits of how we understand connection, because you can understand connection in this way that you're describing, this kind of human connection that comes from the poem Pale Fire. But you can also understand connection when we're talking about art as mutual love of the work and mutual understanding of the work, if that makes sense. Like, if all three of us understand and love Pale Fire in a similar way, then we have a connection. The work has kind of bonded us. So when it comes to art, I can understand connection in that way. Like, this ability to discuss a work of art on a level of shared understanding is connection. So I think that Pale Fire, the novel, is dealing with that specifically, whether or not it's possible for people to have that level of connection over a work. And I think it's kind of upending it a little bit. It's different from the tunnel in that Castell is seeking a different kind of connection. He's seeking kind of a soul connection via art, which I think is different from Pale Fire, the novel. But they're both dealing with connection, a human connection. It's just different kinds of human connection.
Do you guys think it matters that Castell is the person who created this painting? What if instead of being the creator of the painting, he's just a person who understood this painting in a very particular way?
I think it is important because it would say something a little bit different if it was just two admirers of art. Having him as the creator makes it more immediate. It makes it feel more dire, I guess, that he is seeking this kind of connection. Ultimately, it's his soul. This is a projection of him. And so someone supposedly looking at this work and seeing what he thinks should be seen, it's a direct line to him. Two people looking at someone else's art would be, a secondhand experience.
I think if he were not the artist, then it would be more akin to Pale Fire, in that the connection is formed via different readers' experience or the recipient's experience of the art, how that person engages with the artwork and experiences it, and how that kind of experience or engagement might be mutual with someone else. Whereas if he's the artist, then it is different, I think, because you get this feeling that he's putting something of himself in this work of art. Or that's what he says. He says that that woman in the window is maybe the most sincere thing he's done. Not in those words, but reading between the lines, that's what he's intending with the woman in the window.
If I were to imagine a different version or a different timeline for the tunnel where he doesn't get arrested and put in jail, I could imagine this changing his artwork. And instead of being this kind of sincere representational painter, I think he would become more of an Andy Warhol sort of pop artist. Like he would give up on this sort of deeper significance and he would create works that are very superficial. I think that this is a transformative experience. In a way, you could say that he would become less like Shade and more like Nabokov.
I don't know if I agree, just on the reading of the character, because I don't know if he's capable of that. I feel like he's always going to wrench out his own soul into his work, even if he's forever changed. I think at the end, we do see him, he's lost, but his understanding of himself is different from what Sabato is saying about art. He's speaking through Castell, but what Castell is saying about art is not what Sabato is saying about art.
The only reason why I might disagree with you here, Sam, is because when he murders Maria, he destroys the painting. And to me, that signifies that this idea of his artwork connecting him to another person is dead to him now. And if he continued as an artist after seeing that connection is impossible, what would he do? What kind of work would that artist produce?
Do you think he would even continue to create art?
I mean, it's very possible. Here I'm being very speculative. It's difficult to imagine,
right?
Because he is such an unappealing character. It's difficult to imagine him producing anything of value. So if I say to you, oh, he's going to be like Nabokov, it seems almost like blasphemy, right? Like you don't want to think of Nabokov as that sort of person, but just in this one particular way, I do think that this would be the sort of transformative experience for him.
It's transformative, but I don't know where he is at the end of the book as far as art goes. I think you're right. He's given up, but he's given up in a different way from Conrad with Bernhard's book. Bernhard has this very nihilistic approach to art, and I don't think it's nihilism that we're seeing exactly in Sabato's book.
Yeah, I agree there. I think that Castell has something that he sees as valuable. He just feels frustrated that he can't access it. With Conrad, I don't know exactly what he's going for. Like, I think he feels like it would be impossible for anyone to access it.
Yeah, I think so. We talked a lot about the impossibility of any connection or communication, and that's where the nihilism comes in for me. Like, what is even the point of trying? Whereas I don't think that's what either Nabokov or Sabato are saying.
Well, in regards to Pale Fire, I think that you can see Kinboat in the same light as Castell, because he is trying really hard to tell you his story. He wants someone to understand him if you take him at face value. That's the difficulty, is because of the play in the novel. There are multiple ways of interpreting Kinboat, whether he's another aspect of John Shade, or he's his own character, or he's insane. If you read him as just a realist character, then he's someone who's desperately trying to make a connection to the reader and is trying to tell the reader, understand my story. This is who I am. And no one else can tell it. So, in that light, if we read it that way, then you can see him as similar to Castell.
Do you think that he cares so much about his own story, or does he care so much about Shade? Because it seems to me, if he were really driven to express his own story, why would he need this pretext of an annotated poem?
I think if you read him as a realist gay character, then you can argue that he probably loves Shade.
Yes, he probably does, but even if he loves Shade, why does that love need to find its expression in the annotation of this poem? Like, if he has something in his mind that he wants to express to a public, why is this the way he does it?
I think he's very narcissistic. And so he does think he loves Shade, or at the very least feels a close kinship with him. But he doesn't really know how to interact with others. Every interaction he has with other people sees him trying to talk about himself. So this artifice of an annotated work of Shade's is just, he sees it as this great effort to annotate his good friend and to elevate his friend's work. But from the outside, all it seems to us is the chance for him to explain himself and tell his life story. In fact, I think all three of these books do deal with narcissism. One thing I think is interesting is that obsession does have different strains and forms, but all three of the obsessive men in these books feel like they're cut from a very similar narcissistic cloth. Just looking up some of the hallmarks of narcissistic personality disorder, some of the main points are persistent grandiosity, an excessive need for admiration, and a personal disdain and lack of empathy for other people.
I was going to make a joke about your dating profile.
Which all fit to varying degrees with Kinvote, Castell, and Conrad, but still fairly easily. So very generally, we tend to have a distaste for such people in society. Why are they fascinating in media like these books?
I think that Castell is much less charming than Kinbote. I liked Kinbote for the duration of Pale Fire. When I was reading The Tunnel, I did not have the same experience. They are more tolerable in fiction than they would be in real life, of course, but I don't think that they are equally tolerable. I think there is a marked difference between them.
I don't remember which writing teacher said this, but there is a writing teacher somewhere who wrote an essay about writing who said that all stories are about connections and missed connections. Kind of like the Craigslist page, I guess.
Speaking of my dating life.
Yeah, well, it's gone now, I guess. But
so is my dating life.
But this lack of empathy in these characters, that's what makes it interesting, because they're unable to form connections, which drives them to want to form connections. And it makes for good storytelling, because in a lot of stories, that's what you are reading it for. You're reading it for whether or not that person can make or not make a connection. But my question here is, since these books do prioritize either formal play or the philosophical underpinning that the writer wants to get at, for example, Wittgenstein that I mentioned earlier, or Camus. So these books are all focused on ideas rather than people. My question is, would these books be as interesting if the characters were just normal? If they weren't narcissistic or critically flawed in this way, would these books be as interesting? Because one could argue that character doesn't matter at all if the writer is interested in formal play or interested in the philosophy underpinning the story.
I would not say that the character doesn't matter because the author is interested in formal play or a philosophical idea. I think that it's a matter of one serving the other. I think definitely in Pale Fire, character serves metafiction. So, as I said in the episode when we talked about Pale Fire, I didn't read that novel as having real characters. I never thought of Kinboat as a real person. So, it wasn't really a concern whether or not he was normal or not, because I thought that his abnormality just served to structure the metafictional aspect of the novel. That to me was the main point. It wasn't really an issue whether or not he was, what would the word be, neurotypical or not.
And what about the other two books? For example, in The Tunnel, do you think Castell is just a hook? It's just a way for Sabato to get at what he really wants to talk about, which is existentialism. That maybe he just used an interesting character with an interesting plot, but it doesn't really matter who the character is or what the plot is.
I would say no. I would say that, at least in my reading, he does want to talk about existentialism, but in order to talk about that, you have to have some kind of a setup in order for existentialist themes to emerge. And if you change the setup, those themes don't emerge. So it's just a matter of which part serves the other part. I think that you're right that it is serving this theme rather than serving the characters, but I do think that character still matters.
I'm not so sure with The Tunnel. I think that you could have someone who's not obsessive, but you could still have that character serve the story. With Pale Fire, I agree. I think that you do need to have Kinboat because of everything we talked about in those episodes and also what you mentioned earlier, that it needs to be that kind of character, someone who's so self-absorbed that he misreads the text. But I'm not so sure about Castell.
Well, if Castell weren't obsessive, would he still kill Maria? If he doesn't kill Maria, how do we get this expression of frustrated lack of connection?
Right. The whole point of the book is that there is no connection, that even people connecting for the same reason, supposedly, over art, are not kindred spirits necessarily.
Yes, but what I said earlier, I think, still stands true here in that you could read all fiction as connection and misconnection. So you could have a character who is not obsessive, but is still dealing with an inability to make a connection. Let's say your typical online incel. That person doesn't have to be obsessive, but could still fulfill that role of a person who really wants connection, but gets frustrated, and it leads him to murder.
Isn't that a kind of obsession, though?
Maybe. I mean, it depends on. This was actually one of our earlier questions. I feel like we're always referencing our earlier episodes in this episode. But one of my earlier questions, or Iad's question perhaps, was what is obsession? Where do you draw the line between an interest and an obsession?
It's at least a fixation, if not obsession. Maybe there's a distinction between those two. Maybe there isn't. I know this is slightly off topic, but the whole incel thing does feel very much like a fixation on sex as an end-all be-all kind of thing.
I think the absence of sex makes it an end-all be-all sort of thing. Like, for people who are regularly having sex, it feels less important than it would be otherwise. Not to pat myself too heavily on the back, but I'm not too worried about
As a
it.
sex haver.
Speaking from experience,
Yes.
sex is not a big deal, virgins.
But James, I think that your reading is interesting. You could almost say that it's like a structuralist reading where anything could be replaced with anything else as long as it had the same function within the overall structure. But I tend not to believe that nowadays, because I do think of a novel as kind of an organic whole. And when you change one thing, it has knock-on effects on the rest of the text. So if you decided that this character is not going to be obsessive, you have to change everything else to compensate, because everything is connected.
Yes, and I'm also making an assumption here, which is that Sam is accurate in his diagnosis of Castell as having narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, I'm assuming that he is narcissistic in this way. You could argue that maybe he's not. I'd say he is.
I think it's also interesting, though, that we all happen to choose negative aspects of obsession. Partly that's probably just because those aspects make for good fiction.
Yeah, I mean, people don't want to read a happy tale about someone who loves Hello Kitty, you know.
What are the positive aspects of obsession?
Hello Kitty.
You could look at other artists. It doesn't probably come up in fiction as much, but we do tend to laud some level of obsession with nonfiction accounts of certain artists. You know, if you look at any artist really that has a singular kind of focus, we tend to clap that kind of person on the back. I see that more in how we deal with people that we admire rather than characters that we despise, obviously.
That's true, as much as you might say that in one way of looking at, like, Van Gogh, you might say, well, he was just a very passionate guy who cared a lot about his art. But if you read about an unknown artist and he said, oh, he cut off his ear, that would be quite a different situation. You'd be more inclined to look at him as mentally ill. So there is a way of romanticizing obsession or romanticizing mental illness that we do engage in when we talk about people in a different context. But I don't think that romanticizing is valid. I think it's something that we should likewise have disdain for.
Or at least be able to question the acts of such a person without romanticizing it.
Yeah, like mental illness is mental illness, and it's a negative thing. Regardless of whether or not it's somebody that we like, they're still mentally ill, and those people need help. They deserve our empathy rather than us just thinking, oh, wow, it's really cool to be this insane addict or whatever. I think that this obsession that we see, if it's genuine obsession, it's always going to be a negative thing. It's just a matter if people are honest when they're talking about it.
So that also leads me to question, I mean, all of these works are older, but it feels a little bit like they are being put on display, these kinds of characters. Obviously, with narcissism, generally we look at those people, as I said before, with distaste. But there is a fascination here. And my original question was, why are these kinds of people fascinating in books and in art? Do you see that kind of thing waning? That as we begin to understand mental illness better, do you see this kind of obsession less? Do you see this kind of narcissism in characters less?
I'll say two things here. The first one, in response to your question, Sam, is that no, I don't think so, because I think people are always going to be interested in other people who are on the fringes of humanity or society. So you're always going to get stories of serial killers. No one wants to, well, I shouldn't say no one, because there are people who idolize serial killers, but people don't want to be friends with serial killers, but they are interesting in media. People consume a shit ton of books, movies about serial killers. So they always will end up titillating us. I don't think that it's something that is waning, and I don't think it'll ever stop.
Yeah, it's not like those people stop existing just because we understand them better.
Yes, and I think people are still going to be interested in them. The second point I'll make is to, I think it was your question earlier, or maybe it was Iad's question about positive obsession. This is something for anyone who has not been listening to us since the very beginning. The very first book we read was Convenience Store Woman, a woman who's obsessed with convenience stores, and it's portrayed, I'd say, positively in the book, right? Like you guys would say that it's not portrayed in this kind of very negative way that these three books are, and it's contemporary. And you might say that she does have a kind of narcissistic personality disorder, maybe a mild form of it. She is quite narcissistic. So, yeah, I mean, you can have a book that's contemporary from another culture, so another book for our global study of obsession. You can still have that kind of character and have it portrayed positively, I think, because she is portrayed positively in that book.
Yeah, that feels very different to me. I agree, except it does feel different in that it feels like Murata is appealing to the reader to understand this character, whereas I don't think these other writers that we've read, they aren't appeals to understand these characters. As we've already discussed, these characters are, as Iad put it, avatars to get at something underlying. They are there to kind of fight back against communication and against the idea of a universal understanding.
I might put it a different way in that in these three books, the idea of the novel is much more important to the writer, whereas I don't know if that's the case in Murata. I think she is more interested in telling the story of that person. And I think in that episode, even though it was about a year ago, I remember us struggling over exactly what the idea of the novel is. What is the theme of the novel? And if we did not understand it, was it because of the cultural gap? If we didn't understand it, was it because we were not Japanese and we couldn't understand the specific issue that she was writing about? I think that was one of our topics of discussion.
Yeah, I do think that it's really significant, and it's tough for readers to be clear about this, and probably writers aren't clear about it themselves. But is the character meant to be a real person? Does the character have any sort of reality in the same world that the reader lives in? If so, then I don't think that mental illness should be romanticized. But I do think a character like Kinboat exists very deliberately on the page. He doesn't exist off the page. And because of that, whatever Nabokov wants to do with him, I think is fair game. But with a character like, Keiko in Convenience Store Woman, I'm not so sure. There is some sort of a representation of something in Japanese society happening in that novel. And because it does have that kind of aspect of social criticism, it seems to engage with people as real people rather than people as textual features inside of a novel. And that to me crosses a boundary.
Knowing a little bit about her life, it also feels like not a huge step away from her as a person. That Keiko is, at least on some level, similar to Murata. That's kind of what I was getting at with appealing to the reader, trying to show maybe not her exact life, but the life of someone like her. Murata, since she was a convenience store worker, that character, Keiko, is kind of a stand-in for Murata. It's not a one-to-one, and the book is also dealing with a larger issue, not just her obsession with convenience stores. But I got the feeling that Murata was trying to communicate that this kind of obsession was okay. Just leave me alone. This is my life, and I'm going to live it the way I choose. Whereas these characters, as Iad just put it, they are complete fictions. They are there to drive a point that the writer wants to make about art and about communication and about the inability to connect. But that's not exactly what Murata was going for. I think Murata was much more sincere.
Speaking of sincerity, let's talk about the morality that's present or not present in these three novels. So, people who have listened to this podcast might have heard me talk about this, but I'm quite fond of murder mysteries because they are conventionally a story of the restoration of moral order. And it's not that I'm some kind of moralist, I'm just very interested in this idea of restoring moral order and the kind of falsehood of that as well. And I'd say more interesting mystery novels or novels that are adjacent to that genre, they kind of explore a more complicated morality. In these three novels, the reader is presented with a murder, and all three novels have elements of a murder mystery, though they are not really in that genre. I kind of think that, on the dust jacket, it might be described as a murder mystery just to boost sales. I would not say that these are murder mysteries. So, do you think that these three novels advocate for any kind of moral order?
In a word, no.
I'm leaning no too, but I don't know if I missed anything here.
Well, what sort of moral order could there be? It seems like they all include murder, but they don't really care too much about solving crimes. They don't really care too much about preventing murder. They don't really care too much about persecuting criminals. What sort of value judgment or what sort of motivation would the novel have towards pursuing any sort of moral order or moral judgment?
I see a hint of it in the line works because at the very beginning, you get this feeling that this is a jury who is undertaking a kind of judgment of Conrad. It's kind of like these members of a jury who are trying to sift through the facts. That's what it reads like at the beginning, and then it gradually devolves from that to something else. So I see hints of it, but for me, it's also a no. So then my follow-up question then is, do you think that these novels, if they are not advocating for any kind of moral order, are they complicating morality in any way? Are they presenting any sort of alternative ways of looking at morality? Or would you say that these books don't have anything to do with morality at all?
I don't see it as a complication of morality too much. I don't feel like morality is really that important to any of these. I think the arguments being made in each of these books are aside from morality. Morality comes into play, but it's not a focus, I don't think.
I think you could say that the worldview of each novel is kind of predicated on the absence of traditional morality. Like, if we were looking at the world when we read these novels in the typical way, then a lot of effort would have been spent in the text trying to understand why bad things were happening and being concerned with the people doing these bad things being punished or receiving some sort of justice in a way that is satisfactory. And that would have diffused the ability of the novel to accomplish other things. I think that you have to set morality aside, if not directly to challenge morality, but just to set it aside so that you can get towards other things. It's naive to expect anytime there's a murder on the page to have the reader think, well, who did it? Why did he do it? How can we bring him to justice? Like, that's a very limited view of fiction.
I think one way that morality can be complicated is if people commit a murder and get away with it. Like, that's a very typical way that morality is complicated in these kinds of stories. But in all three novels, I think you might say that the perpetrator of the murder is punished. And I'm not saying that these are moral texts. It's almost like they're punished as an afterthought. Like, does it really matter that Castell is in prison? I don't think so. But he is in prison, and he has been judged by the public.
I think it matters just as a pretext for him to speak. It's an opportunity for him to express everything that happened from the beginning to the end in a unbroken monologue. It's the pretext for the novel's existence, in a sense. So it could be otherwise. I don't think it's very significant that he was captured, but I do think of it as an expose. I think that he has something that he wants to say, and through saying what he wants to say, the reader of the novel or somebody in the world of the novel reading what Castell has to say would understand the existential ideas that motivated him to kill Maria, and those ideas would be expressed. So I think that Sabato probably wanted to find a pretext for that kind of exposition, and him being captured satisfied that. It wasn't about him being brought to justice. It was about him having a chance to speak and having other people listen to him.
So I don't know if you guys have read this essay, but Mary Gordon in 2005 wrote an essay for The Atlantic. It's titled Moral Fiction. And it's responding to a John Gardner book of the same name, Moral Fiction. In that essay, she argues that serious fiction should present moral complexity. And she's responding to John Gardner's book where he advocates for, quote, hard-won, defiant affirmations in fiction. And of course, he's writing this decades ago. He argues that writers are dishonoring the seriousness of their calling when they are concerned with technique rather than content, and when they think of their work as a species of play. So a quote from that book is, motion, glitter, texture for its own sake has come to be the central value in the arts, he laments. We talked about how these books may not have any kind of moral complexity. So are these books anything more than play? And I know that he's being dismissive here, but obviously we are not dismissive of play in novels. But this idea of play, is it more than just play? And if it's not more than just play, what makes it serious or worthwhile fiction?
I think calling it play is extremely dismissive.
Oh, really? I don't think so. I think it's good. No, I'm being totally sincere. I actually think play is good in fiction. I would not read it as dismissive. Or I don't understand it personally as dismissive.
I picture someone like Gardner calling it play the same way he uses the word glitter.
What do you have against glitter?
It's very hard to clean up.
What don't I have against glitter? Both those things make it sound like, well, as he put it, texture for its own sake. It's a very surface level look at art and a very surface level look at enjoyment of, for example, play, and of what technique means to an art form. It seems very dismissive of how art changes over time and how writers are interested in different aspects of their art. This goes back to what we were talking about with John Williams and Eva Winters, that it's very dismissive of anything other than what they see as the pinnacle of their art. They're so focused on a more straightforward approach that you can't have any other style, or at least that any other style is... God, I am failing with words. James, this is your fault, I'm sure.
Well, it's putting narrative on a pedestal. It's saying narrative
Yes.
is what's important, and that fiction without any compelling narrative is not serious fiction. So you've talked about this second part, that you're saying it is worthwhile. This kind of play is worthwhile. But setting aside any value judgment on play and whether or not it's worthwhile, do you think there is anything more than play here?
Yeah, I think they're saying a lot. If you go back to our different discussion episodes on these books, we do talk quite a bit about what's going on behind that play. Even if it's morally straightforward in some cases, not complicated, they're all talking about something deeper than what's going on the page.
James, just to clarify here, though, it seems like you're describing Gardner's stance as saying that narrative is the kind of polar opposite to play. Is that the way you see it?
It's not, because I don't think those are polar opposites. But I think he's saying that form versus story is the battle line. And when he says technique rather than content, technique is the method of telling the story, experimenting with either language or form. And then content, I would say, is narrative, but it also includes other aspects of fiction. So I wouldn't say it's like polar opposites. I would say like he's divided it up in this way. And one falls in one group, one subset, and the other falls in the other subset of what he thinks is technique and what he thinks is content. But we're also not, we have not read this book, Moral Fiction, so I don't want to get into it too much.
Yeah, the way I understand it, again, you're right, not having read Moral Fiction, is that he's positioning play opposite moral content, specifically content that can inform us in a very serious moral way. And I think, first of all, just to come to the defense of play, I think play is very important. In my mind, at least, the way I conceptualize play is the ability to capture someone's attention. And things very quickly get played out, so to speak. And whenever we have play, we invariably engage with other more serious types of content. It's never quote unquote mere play, because in order for us to continually be captivated by it, we have to engage with other things. The best example I always can come back to when it comes to a playful novel is Yoko Tawada's The Emissary. In that novel, it's very playful, but it's not light on content. It has a lot of content, but it's specifically not moral content. So I think when he thinks about play, he's thinking about it as if it were the absence of content, when it's definitely not. If it were truly the absence of content, it would cease to be playful. It would be boring. I think also, just to kind of get back to this idea that fiction should be moral, it's based on a very naive idea of what modern and postmodern fiction is about. I think that fiction can show us moral ideas about how to live and how to treat other people, but it doesn't have to.
Do you think that when he's talking about moral fiction, and of course we are not talking about the book really because we haven't read it here for this episode, do you think it's related to what we were talking about in regards to sincerity? What we were saying is that we are trying to convey some kind of, I describe it as kind of like a deeply held belief or emotion, and that we talked about how there is not much sincerity in these three books.
From what you've given us of Gardner, that is my understanding, that he's an advocate for sincere work that does deliver some kind of moral stance.
I think maybe not specific to these three books, but in postmodern fiction in general, there is a sincerity of a different type. I think that when you look at the book and what's included in the book, it's very easy to see it as the result of a specific set of choices, but it's also a set of choices that delimits what's not included in the book and why these books are so different from other books that we've read. And the deliberate exclusion of quote unquote moral content is done as the result of probably very sincerely held beliefs about what morality is. And I think that fiction can engage with another set of content, which is that the idea of morality is full of paradoxes and full of dead ends. And I think that those paradoxes and dead ends can influence a writer to steer clear of this kind of very easy moralizing that we might find in another type of fiction, maybe something like George Orwell's 1984. When we realize that morality is often impossible or often paradoxical, we may choose to write something more like, the Limeworks, or we may choose to write something more like Pale Fire.
What's interesting about 1984 in this context is I've read 1984. I think you guys probably have as well, or, Animal Farm or any other similar kind of book. I think what's interesting is that for me, Pale Fire is much more interesting as a read. I like Pale Fire a lot more, but those kinds of books are deemed, quote, important, and many more people read them, and they're required reading for high school, right? So it seems that, and we're getting a bit off topic here, but it seems that you might say there is some kind of need for that kind of moral fiction that is somehow more crucial to our society. And this is not me dismissing these books because I love these books, but when we use the word play, we kind of say that, well, it's optional. It's something extra like dessert.
I would say those are easier things to teach. Those sorts of books are easier to teach than especially something like Pale Fire. I think The Tunnel you could teach fairly easily, but Pale Fire and The Limeworks would be tougher, especially
to high schoolers?
In a high school setting. Yeah.
Yeah, try teaching the
Exactly.
Limeworks to high schoolers.
Right. But also, I think you're right that we're not just teaching high school students and below about works of art and important stories, quote unquote, important stories. There is something to be said about that moral character, about the moral stances of such books. I bet we could look at the canon that we give to high school students and I would be surprised if it's not almost solely composed of moral fiction.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think I would be surprised if they were not works of moral fiction. But for me, that's not the end all be all. I think it's one way of looking at value. If we're just being base here, the value of fiction is that it can impart morality to young people. But if you're someone who studies literature and you're reading it for pleasure, then that's not the only reason you're reading it. You're not reading it for that value. You're reading it for another kind of value.
I mean, just to answer your question here, James, it does often seem like play or things that are specifically amoral appear secondary to moral fiction. But I think that's really just an after effect of morality being so obvious. The desire for morality, the desire for justice in the world is so human. It's something that we all strive for. We only realize the paradoxes of it later on in life. So I think that morality appeals to a baser human instinct than any sort of fiction that would question it. And for that reason, I think maybe somebody like Gardner hasn't developed his sense for the concerns of an amoral novel like Pale Fire in the same way that he would have for an anti-totalitarian moral novel like 1984. I think it's quite easy to understand why Big Brother is bad, but very difficult to understand why Kinbote is an endearing, if flawed, person.
I'm going to give myself the last word here before we put a pin in it, if that's okay. I think what you've said here, yet actually, is probably the argument that John Williams of Stoner or John Gardner or Ivor Winters would make, which is that there is something important here that makes it worthwhile. Whereas this kind of amoral fiction, as you're terming it, it's just not as important. I think that's what they would say. And I don't think we would agree, but I think that's what they would say.
I hate to give you the last word here only because it seems like your last word is saying easy equals good and hard equals bad.
Yeah, I'm not taking a stance either way. I'm saying that's what they would say. I don't know if they would agree with it being easier or more difficult. I think that's where they would disagree. But I think they're saying that there is something important here, that there's a reason why these books get taught. There's a reason why, the classics, quote unquote, of literature, the canonical books are often moral fiction.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a short break here. And when we come back, we will talk about whether or not these books should be part of the high school curriculum. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, we just talked about how in high school, students don't often read these kinds of books. Do you think that these books can be taught in high school?
I would say no to the Limeworks. I think that one would be difficult to do well in high school, not just because of the particulars of the crime, but I think the form would be difficult for most high school readers.
I mean, it was difficult for us.
At least
Well,
two
me
of
and
us.
you. Yes. Ed loved it.
I think the tunnel is probably the easiest to teach, partly because of how straightforward it is. There is more going on with the existentialism, but it's still fairly straightforward. Pale Fire, I think, would be difficult to do. However, I could see a teacher wanting to dive into different ways of reading a text.
It might be a 12th grade honors English kind of book. I could see it in
Yes.
that kind of book because it would be taught, I would say, to a freshman in college.
Sam, here, I want to put you on the spot. I want to do a little bit of role playing. I know you're into it. I'm going to be the student.
Nice.
Oh, Mr. Spieler, Mr. Spieler.
Are you guys dressing up too?
Oh, I'm already dressed in my schoolgirl outfit.
You're going to be in detention later.
Mr. Spieler, Mr. Spieler.
Yes, little Ed.
You're telling me this guy killed his girlfriend and then he went to jail. So what?
I didn't say that I wanted to teach this book.
Shut up, you little shit. Read this part about the painting.
I'm being somewhat facetious here, but I think that these themes that we see and we can talk about are difficult. I don't think that every theme is meant for every reader. And I'm just trying to imagine how this theme could be accessible to a 15-year-old student.
Well, we already talked about how there are similarities with Camus. I read The Stranger in, I don't know, sophomore year maybe?
But you're fucking weird.
Also read The Plague around the same time.
Yep, weirdo.
But
so could you dumb it down? Like if you heard me saying, oh, Mr. Spieler, so what? What does it mean? Like, how would you dumb it down for me?
I'd tell the student to check out this really good podcast I've been listening to.
Have you heard of Spark Notes?
I'd have to bring up a bigger point about existentialism and talk about the history of it and what that whole movement was about.
Well, okay, I will take you off the spot. I think that a lot of texts are taught in high school just to give the students a taste with the full understanding that they will not fully understand the text and perhaps they will return to it later. You do get, books that are very easy to understand, but you also, at least in my high school experience, and we've actually, once again, talked about this on our subreddit in one of our previous discussions, we've talked about how like different high schools have different requirements. In my high school, we do have books that were taught in college that are taught to high schoolers and they can take as an elective course. So I don't think the teacher fully expects the student to understand, but I think the teacher hopes that the student will be intrigued and that this is the seed of some knowledge that might bloom in the future.
Yeah, off air, we talked about how I attempted to teach, speaking of John Gardner's Grendel to a group of high school English students over their summer education. Putting aside the flawed theory in that.
And why you were fired subsequently.
Right. That is similar in that it's a book that's about Grendel, the mythical creature in Beowulf. But the much more interesting things happening in that book are explorations of nihilism and different philosophies as discussed between Grendel and the dragon, and what that means with a so-called moral character like Beowulf. And obviously that didn't go over well, not just because it was summer class, but also because it's heady stuff. I don't think that means you can't talk about such things. But you're right. You have to have the right readers and certainly the right teacher. I was probably not that teacher. But James, you mentioned honors class. Yeah, I think some of these books could be taught in honors, but maybe not in the sort of class where the kids just want to get by.
So let's get you on record here, Yed. What about you? Would you say that they could be taught in high school, or would you say that they should not be taught in high school?
I'm going to dodge this by giving you a non-answer. I think that the reason why it's difficult to imagine teaching any of these is because there is a difference between the way we think about teaching fiction and the way we talk about teaching other subjects. When we teach a math class and we show kids the quadratic equation, we expect them to be able to do something with it. We expect quote unquote mastery. But when we show somebody pale fire or we show somebody the tunnel, and even in honors class, do we expect the same things from him? Like, can we expect him to do with this work the same thing that a college student could do or a professor could do? I would say no. We just hope that if we give him a bunch of content, maybe 10% of it will stick. And that to me seems like the wrong way to teach.
It seems like you exchanged your schoolgirl costume for something else now.
Yes, I put on my Professor Tweed outfit.
So then how do you approach any book? Because even picking moral fiction, certainly there's going to be things that high school students can't suss out as well as college students or as well as
Right.
a college professor.
In the interest of time, I'll keep it kind of broad. When you're talking about a novel and you're teaching a novel, if you teach something like Pale Fire, I think a high school student could get maybe 50% out of it. If you teach him 1984, I think he could get 90% out of it. If you teach him something like Station 11,
Art is good.
if we teach him something like Station 11 that we read a couple months ago, he could probably get like 70% out of it. So it's just a matter of averages. I think that you can never exhaust a novel, but you can get more out of it. And when you're talking about these novels, it just seems like if you're lucky, you're going to get 30, 40, 50% out of it. You're going to leave a lot of it on the table. So why bother?
I'm going to ask one more question because I can't help myself. But I just want you guys to give a very brief one-sentence answer. What about teaching this to college students, not grad students, but undergrads? Would you say yes to all three?
Major or non-major?
I think they would have to be majors because I don't think, I mean, you can answer for both, but I don't think you would teach this in a comp class.
No, I think they'd have to be there for the purpose of...
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine a way I would teach like even the tunnel in a comp class just because, like that's not what you would teach in comp, right? And that's only a non-major class people would take.
I would say yes, you can teach all of them. I think that the Limeworks is definitely upper division, but the Tunnel and Pale Fire are probably like first or second year.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yep, I feel the same way. I think the Limeworks is something that you probably really need to be comfortable with ideas before you can even really talk about it. Whereas with Pale Fire, even though it is kind of, I wouldn't say experimental, I guess, but it's more playful. I think as English major, you understand that play. Let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. Next week, we will begin our new series on Afrofuturism with a review of Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. We've also got an updated reading schedule on Reddit at Canonical Pod. And on Reddit, we also post threads for our book club discussion every Friday. If you'd like to talk about the topics we just discussed here, or about any of the other books, go on Reddit and chat with us there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.